right, Justin, I'm so excited to talk to you. I was just telling you, it feels like it's been ships passing in the night over the last couple of years, given the incredible work you're doing in experimentation of animals and the fights I've had with the same industry. But I thought I'd start because it's topical with this thing you wrote in Newsweek recently about DOGE, because it feels like the entire world, at least my world, I live in San Francisco, as you imagine. Most people in San Francisco are not fans of Trump or DOGE or Elon at this point. And you just penned an article about how DOGE could be good for dogs and good for animals. And DOGE, for those of us who have not heard about this, is the Department of Government Efficiency that's being proposed and run by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So when the rest of the left in the animal rights movement is melting down about how Trump's going to destroy the government and undermine all the protections for animals, why are you so down for DOGE?
Well, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Wayne, and thanks for all your great work to get animals out of labs and protect them from abuse. Listen, it's never always sunshine and rainbows for animals, no matter who's running the government, or, whether who has the majority in Congress or who's sitting in the White House. It's actually pretty bad news for animals generally, and it's always been that way. But I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that, at least under the first Trump administration, there were people running federal agencies who were receptive to arguments against animal experimentation based on cruelty and government waste on unnecessary and outdated experiments, and made some historic progress in that area. With Trump coming back into power and with the circle of people he surrounded himself with, like Elon Musk, like Vivek, who are looking to cut government waste, they have already been highlighting as examples of things that should end up on the chopping block, wasteful animal experimentation that White Coat Waste Project has uncovered over the last few years, like injecting puppies with cocaine or sending money to Russian labs to sever cats' spines and force them to walk on treadmills, gambling experiments with monkeys, all kinds of wasteful experiments that not only are squandering, billions of tax dollars every year, but also wasting a lot of animals' lives and time and not providing a return on investment for taxpayers who are forced to fund this stuff. So this is an area where we can find common ground, I think, with people who might not agree on every animal issue. Certainly White Coat Waste's approach has been to not have a litmus test for anybody when it comes to animal testing. And if you agree about wanting to end taxpayer-funded animal testing, you're on our team and you could be part of the solution. And we're very optimistic based on the fact, Vivek and Elon have been posting about these wasteful animal experiments, and that they're, poster children for government waste. You have people like Tulsi Gabbard, Mike Waltz, a lot of people, Lee Zeldin, who's going to be running the EPA. These are all people who have worked with White Coat Waste over the past few years to target and end animal experimentation. And now these people are going to be running the government. And I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I can't speak to other animal issues. I think, as usual, it's going to be a mixed bag. But I think when it comes to animal testing, we have people who have a proven track record of not only caring about these issues, but actually doing something about it and making some historic progress. So we're bullish.
Yeah. So let's talk about specifics, because I think this is going to be surprising, maybe even shocking for folks to hear. Everyone in San Francisco thinks Trump and his administration are just going to run everything into the ground and abandon everyone who's marginal and vulnerable, including animals. And I think what's particularly surprising is a lot of people know Elon is not exactly the most pro-animal guy. And Elon's going to have disproportionate influence on this administration, I think, and he's going to be running DOGE along with Vivek. So can you just tell us specifically, what are the sort of interactions you had and who are the specific individuals you've worked with that made you optimistic about the prospect of the Trump administration actually doing good things, at least on animal experimentation? Like, what are some stories? What are some examples of this?
Yeah, well, I think we could look at DOGE in particular. Number one, Vivek has repeatedly posted on Twitter. Not only is he an ethical vegetarian and supporter of animal rights, but again, he's posted that he opposes some of these animal experiments that we've been targeting. But if you look at who they've chosen in the House and the Senate to kind of be their allies on the ground on Capitol Hill to be taking on these programs, the Senate lead is Senator Joni Ernst. And I think maybe people who are, certainly your listeners and folks in the animal movement might be surprised to learn that Joni Ernst, who ran on a platform of make them squeal, which is a reference to pig castration when she first came to Congress. And there was a reference to that, but also that she was going to come to Washington and clean up waste and be aggressive about it. She's been one of the best leaders on attacking government animal experimentation over the last few years. She's gotten a number of projects canceled, experiments on dogs and cats that were funded, approved, and scheduled to be conducted, and working with us was able to get them canceled before they started. She's leading legislation to defund animal labs in adversarial nations like Russia and China, and has been outspoken. She's met with us with beagles rescued from laboratories on several occasions and spoken about the need to do more to cut wasteful and unnecessary government experimentation on dogs and cats. And she's the DOGE lead. She's been in her kind of top 10 lists of wasteful projects, has included a number of experiments on dogs and cats that she wants to cut. And we've been in touch with her about kind of a laundry list of things that we want to see happen on day one, first 100 days on Capitol Hill, when the new Congress and the White House are seated. Marjorie Taylor Greene, again, another person who we've worked with attacking animal experiments funded by Dr. Fauci. Again, no matter what people think of him in general, he's a horrible villain when it comes to animal experimentation. 100%. In the 1980s, he was personally infecting chimpanzees with HIV. He was personally doing that. And he was actually the principal investigator, the lead experimenter on primate experiments until the very day he left the NIH a couple years ago. There were still grants with him as the lead where they were infecting primates with HIV and AIDS-like viruses and watching them die. So even if people's hatred for Fauci is the reason they may have gotten involved in this issue in the first place, the outcome for animals might be the same. Ending experiments that he approved or funded or was involved in some way. So I don't care what people's motivation is, whether it's for just for animals or for cutting waste or for Fauci or for both. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the new Congress to get animals out of laboratories and kind of harness, whatever these interests are and find common ground with people. And that's what white coat waste is all about, is, finding strange bedfellows and building these coalitions to get things done.
Yeah. Strange bedfellows is a good way of putting it, because I think for most folks in on the left, and maybe in the animal rights movement, although I think Fauci might be an exception to this, the animal rights movement is typically aligned with the left. It's seen as mostly a liberal issue. And I think a lot of people on the left, and probably a lot of animal rights activists, think of Fauci as mostly a hero and people like Joni Ernst as mostly villains. And I do remember this ad of Joni Ernst talking about pig castration and how much she loved and for those of you who don't know, virtually every male pig in this country has their testicles ripped off with no painkillers as they're squealing in agony. And some of them have complications and actually die because it's a surgical procedure being performed without anesthesia, without veterinary supervision. It's horrible. And most people think of Fauci as like he's the one who defended us from COVID, stood up for science and that sort of thing. But you're right about Fauci. The more you dive into some of his animal experiments, it's disturbing. And you start thinking, man, maybe RFK's got a point, because, the RFK has this book, The Real Anthony Fauci. That's kind of a disturbing portrait of just the psychology of this man. And when you read about some of the experiments he performed, it's kind of terrifying. If I recall correctly, is it correct to say that those primate experiments where he injected all these primates with viruses also didn't seem to have much any scientific benefit at all?
Yeah, they were a complete failure. He was promising. The reason there ended up being so many chimps in laboratories through the 90s and early 2000s, and fortunately it was ended about a decade ago, is because he was promising that infecting chimpanzees with HIV was going to be the silver bullet for solving AIDS and curing AIDS and developing a vaccine. We still don't have one. Half a century later, we actually don't have one. And he was wrong about that. And what we ended up with was a surplus of chimpanzees who were then just being tortured for no reason in laboratories because they were there. People were just thinking of sick experiments to do on them just because they had this resource available to them. Yeah. Fortunately, Congress got involved. And in around 2009, 2010, the National Academies, at the behest of Congress, did an investigation and found that chimpanzee research was unnecessary, which is what, people like me and others were saying for a long time. So, it was a complete waste of animals' lives, of money, of time, giving false hope to patients. But that's kind of the legacy of animal experimentation. We have the same problem now. Fauci's gone, but there's other people who have taken his place and other people who are just as bad as him. But, I would argue not argue. I mean, if you care about animals and care about animal testing, he's a villain.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also argue and believe that he is the one who is responsible for causing COVID with people that he funded at EcoHealth Alliance and Wuhan Institute of Virology. Congress just came out with a report this week saying that lab leak was the most likely cause of the COVID pandemic that killed 20 million people. And not only did he fund those experiments, he repeatedly perjured himself and lied about it to Congress. So, yeah, he's a bad guy. If you care about animals, Fauci's not a friend.
Yeah. I would be more skeptical about this, but what happened with Fauci and Beaglegate is actually pretty disturbing. And that was your work too. And you guys did a tremendous job. And I was honestly just pretty disturbed by the Washington Post's response. I want you to tell the story because it's a disturbing story about the way the government can cover up its own misdeeds. And this is a micro example of it. But it suggests that maybe bigger cover-ups are also happening. So do you want to jump into that? Your initial interest of Fauci was not, I think, from COVID or Wuhan, although that is an animal issue too, because a lot of the experimentation that was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was actually animal experimentation. They were like retrieving all these animals from caves all over China, bringing them to the Wuhan Institute to study the viruses and then perform this weird gain of function research. But I think you initially got interested in Fauci as someone who was a villain for the animal rights movement because of these Beagle experiments. Could you just tell me a little bit about those experiments and what you found?
Yeah, so in 2016, when WICO kind of first launched, we put out a report called Spending to Death about dog testing inside federal agencies. So not only do federal agencies, let me rewind a second. The U.S. government is the single largest funder of animal testing in the world.
Yeah.
Over $20 billion is being spent by the U.S. government every year on animal testing. The majority of that money is coming from the National Institutes of Health, but other agencies too, like the Department of Defense, the USDA, the National Science Foundation, NASA, on and on. So we put out a report in 2016 looking at dog experimentation inside government labs. So not necessarily what they were funding at colleges and universities and private companies, but inside government labs. And one of the projects that we documented at the time was an experiment being done in the in-house laboratories of the NIH division run by Dr. Fauci, the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease. And in these experiments, beagles were being taken into the lab. Their hair was being shaved off their necks, and then they were being having capsules full of infected sandflies strapped to their necks to bite them, cause them this disease called leishmaniasis, and then watching the disease progress. And they were getting open sores, their paws were swollen. They actually we got photos of this that they had taken through FOIA, and we released those back then. And we kind of kept an eye on that project. And then the way we came to Fauci is actually interesting. In 2018, we did an investigation where we exposed a kitten lab at the USDA. And this kitten lab had been going on for decades. And part of the project involved, this sounds crazy, but it's true, and we have all the receipts. USDA staff would fly to China and other places, go to wet markets, buy dog and cat meat, and then fly that dog and cat meat back to the United States to a lab outside of DC, and then force feed kittens cat meat and dog meat.
Jesus.
Yeah. Wild stuff.
Yeah.
So this was happening for years. We exposed this project and we shut it down. And we thought this was the government's largest cat lab. Hasn't reopened since. Actually, our president and founder, Anthony Fauci, adopted 2 of the cats from this lab when it was shut down. And this happened under Trump, by the way. The lab was shut down under Trump. So
can I actually ask, why were they doing this? That sounds just so macabre and disturbing and totally messed up.
This was a project related to toxoplasmosis. So basically, this laboratory kept getting refunded to go around the world and buy different types of meat from supermarkets, from farms, from wet markets, and then study how prominent the toxoplasmosis parasites were in different types of meat around the US and other parts of the world. And the way they were doing that at the time was by feeding it to cats and then studying their feces. So they basically had what we called this kitten slaughterhouse, where they would breed hundreds of cats every year, kittens each year. When they were 8 weeks old, they would force feed them this meat. They would collect their feces and then kill the cats, even though the cats were healthy and adoptable. So we were able to expose that, shut it down, and get a few dozen of the cats released from that laboratory.
Wow.
But that tipped us off to the fact that there was a lot of taxpayer money going to these labs in foreign countries. So we started investigating.
Well, can I ask you one more question about this cat lab?
Please.
Because this is the first time I've heard of this, and this is
Yeah.
super disturbing. How did it get shut down? Like, how did you manage to get Trump to do this? I mean, I assume you didn't go to the man himself and say like,
No,
Donald, can you
not in
shut
this
down the
case. We
cat lab?
didn't. We rallied. We have 3 million members. We rallied an enormous amount of grassroots support, pressure on the USDA. We were running, public ads, call-ins, all of that. But we also, and this is what we do with all of our campaigns, united a coalition of Republicans and Democrats in Congress to put pressure on the USDA, write fact-finding letters, investigate, introduce legislation to defund the project, and eventually, after about a year, the USDA said mercy.
We're done.
And at the agency level, and we have received emails through FOIA subsequently showing that Sonny Perdue, the secretary of the USDA at the time, had basically told the staff, we need to do something about this, and they shut the project down.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I don't have the fondest views of Sonny Perdue, but that makes me feel slightly better about him because he was terrible on most ag issues. Actually, before you jump into the other Fauci stuff, can you just conceptually explain? I think a lot of people are confused about how these things get funded in the first place. And I think you're right that these animal experimentation, animal agricultural funding programs are like this endless spigot that never stops. So what is it? I mean, how did these things get funded in the first place? And why is there no one who comes in and says, this is completely insane? Why are we force feeding kittens dead cats from China? And I think most people just don't understand. I think you and I understand because we've been in the belly of the beast, just how little accountability there is within the government, especially when you're talking about, the most marginalized community on the face of the planet, the animals, right? But can you explain, how do these projects get funded in the first place? And why is there no adult upstairs saying like, wait, why are we doing this?
That's a great question. This is why people are so scared of this incoming administration. Because for a very long time, it's been the fox guarding the hen house. And if you look at animal experimentation, for example, the committees that review, approve, and fund these projects are all made up of animal experimenters.
Yeah.
So you have animal experiment, and the process by which they're reviewed and approve these projects is not like a blind process either. So there's conflict of interest at every level, where you have people who support you have people who support animal experimentation, responsible, and conduct animal experimentation, responsible for reviewing and approving others' projects. And of course, there's the fear that if you don't approve theirs, then in the future, yours might not get approved.
Yep.
So if you look at the data, and I've published, lots of other people have published about this, about 99% of the projects that get approved, about 99% of the projects that are proposed, animal experimentation projects that are proposed, are approved and funded.
Yeah.
So there's just conflicts of interest, and there's biases, and the system has to be disrupted somehow. And that's why people are so concerned with people like Jay Bhattacharya and RFK and others coming into power at HHS and other agencies. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that there's a very, very powerful lobby that is up on Capitol Hill asking for more money. And this lobby is made up of colleges and universities, very powerful colleges and university professors and scientific organizations who are getting rich off animal experimentation. Colleges and universities get the lion's share of the money coming out of the NIH, for example. The NIH has a nearly $50 billion budget. Most of it's going to colleges and universities. And those schools take 30% off the top of all these grants just for slush funds. And then 70% goes to research. So this is a huge money-making enterprise for colleges and universities. They don't care about animal experimentation one way or another. It doesn't matter to them. They just see dollar signs. Where you see a dog, they see a dollar sign. And that's a problem. So they're up on Capitol Hill. Every time we attack one project, they all rally and sign these coalition letters with dozens and dozens of professional organizations, lobby groups, and colleges and universities saying, oh, we can't let this happen. You have to keep the money flowing. They lie about the fact that these things are necessary to improve human health. And then they fearmonger. And these are just jobs programs for scientists. That's what this is.
Yeah, you're right. And so one example of this is, I don't know if you've been following Margaret Livingstone's case with that PETA's been working on. I imagine you guys have been following that to some degree, maybe even working with PETA, because I know your brother used to work at PETA. I've worked with your brother a little bit as well, who's amazing. But so Margaret Livingstone was doing these terrible maternal deprivation experiments on primates, basically tearing these babies from their moms and watching how they're psychologically, basically tortured from deprivation of their mother's love, which is something that pretty much all mammals have, right? We're mammals because our moms give us milk. And so there's an evolutionary desire to be with your mom from the day you're born. And we've known maternal deprivation is horrible going back, decades ago to, Harry Harlow and those terrible experiments he performed back in, was the 1960s or 70s? I don't remember what it was. There was this evil lab at the University of Wisconsin, very close to where I was litigating the Ridglan case. And Margaret Livingstone was seeking funding for these maternal deprivation experiments on the grounds that it would help cure brain cancer. And if you're asking, how does tearing mother primates from their babies help cure brain cancer? You're asking exactly the sort of question that no one else is asking, because you're right. It is the fox guarding the henhouse. And the way I explain it to people who ask, why do you think the Department of Ag or the FDA or the USDA or the National Institutes of Health, why don't you trust them? Why do you think they're making the right decisions? Imagine that I, as an animal rights activist, went to trial in one of these open rescue, animal rescue cases, and I get to pick only vegans for the jury. If I got to do that, we'd win them all. I mean, we'd win the ones that I don't deserve to win, for sure, right? And that's how biased it is. It's totally biased. It's a corrupt insider baseball game where it's completely incestuous, and all the people whose buddies are working in the same industry get to make the decisions on behalf of whose projects get funded. And lo and behold, they all fund each other's projects. And yeah, Margaret Livingstone is an exception. It's also mostly men in these sorts of industries, whether it's animal experimentation or kind of exploitation of animals in agriculture. So it's super messed up. One other explanation I often give, I don't know if you knew this about me, but did you know my dad was a vivisector for like 40 years?
No, I didn't know this.
Yeah. Sorry if this makes you think less of me now. I mean, this is the reality of the world we live in. So the interesting thing is my dad was a vivisector, but he's also just a really kind person. And he was only working with direct experiments early in his career. And he started as a grad student. He was a PhD in organic chemistry at the University of Illinois. And one of the things he told me is that, well, two things. One is scientists think very hard, but very narrowly, especially in today's world, where science has become it's become so specialized that, basically you have like a very narrow area that you're focusing your dissertation on and ultimately your research, and other things and other paradigms you don't think at all about. And so he was basically bestowed upon him was this paradigm of animal testing that he never spent even a moment thinking about or looking at scientific research on. This was just part of science. And he was focused, his focus was metabolic disease in human beings, which is important. And there's a lot of really good research, including, I'd say mostly non-animal research. And if you know anything about metabolic disease, they've done a lot of horrible experiments on like pigs, for example, because they actually used to extract insulin from pigs to give to human beings. And but the point is, scientists are specialists who don't think broadly, and especially are not taught to think about moral issues and trade-offs. They don't think about, all right, if we have to waste 1 million pigs' lives to increase the odds that we do something good for diabetes by 0.001%, right? They're not asked to make those trade-offs. They're just taught to do this little thing that they're doing. And it's really up to society as a whole and a democracy to decide what trade-offs are worth it. But the other thing he said is a lot of the reason because he now is against, for the record, my dad is a huge animal rights supporter. He now regrets everything he's done. I'm really proud of him. He's an amazing human being. He gives an enormous amount of money to end animal experimentation. But the other thing he told me is there's just such a strong culture. If you're a scientist who comes out and says, wait, why are we decapitating these mice? Why are we genetically engineering these pigs to be morbidly obese? Like when the drugs don't seem to be working anyways, and we have these other models like molecular modeling, organ on a chip that seem to be improving and better. And a huge part of it was just this culture, and in particular, this culture that animal rights activists are like heathens. They're these barbarians who don't understand science. And if you side with them, it's almost like you're siding with religious fundamentalists. Like you don't believe in evolution, that sort of thing. And it's like, it was really weird for me to hear because, I'm his son. He raised me to respect science and care about science and think about evidence. And I'm one of those people. And I honestly think that if I had not become an animal rights activist, he still might to this day be supportive of animal experimentation, and still might to this day think that all animal rights activists are just heathens who hate science, which isn't true. We just want science to be valid. We want science to stay within the domain that science can teach us on, which is what are the empirical truths of the universe, not giving moral judgments that the rest of the nation has to accept, right? So I don't know. It'd be fascinating to see you talk to my dad at some point. Anyways, I interrupt. If you have anything on that, feel free to jump in.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I say to people all the time, I think solving animal experimentation is not a scientific problem. It's a cultural problem to solve.
Yeah.
Number one, you don't have students who love science as young kids thinking about decapitating mice for a living and be like, oh yeah, that's something that excites me. I mean, it's a process where they're slowly desensitized to it, through dissection when they're young in the classroom, which is more and more, less and less common over time, which is good, but animal dissection. And then you get to undergrad and maybe your first job is, as a lab assistant in an animal lab, just making sure animals are fed on the weekends or something. And then eventually you're decapitating them. And then eventually you're designing the experiments and making a lot of money doing it. So I think it's something that happens over time, and it is part of the culture in science. My wife and I published a study a few years ago about the representations of animal experimentation and animal ethics in psychology textbooks. And there's actually, they call the sections, like ethics, but there's actually no discussions of ethics. They're just about they villainize animal people who are opposed as zealots, anti-science zealots, and then they just talk about these imaginary benefits and use fear-mongering basically to justify animal experimentation. There's actually no conversation about the different ethical arguments for and against animal experimentation. So it is a cultural problem. But that's why I see a lot of what we do at White Coat Waste is to stigmatize animal experimentation. That you have to make it so it's not something that's laudable and that people are impressed by, but that people should be ashamed of and they don't want to talk about and then don't want to do for a living because you don't want to have to tell someone you do that. I think, there's been a naivete in the movement for a long time that animal experimentation is a scientific problem to solve and that we need alternatives to the things that we're doing now in order to fix it. And I don't think that's the case, because if you go down that road, you're never going to have all the alternatives. There's always going to be an excuse. Well, there's a replacement for this, but not for that. And this doesn't, it's not like, we have the best veggie burgers in the world. We have the best plant-based burgers that there's ever been in history, and people still don't want them. So it's not, it's not a matter of making alternatives available. It's a matter of getting people to just stop. And the way White Coat Waste thinks is the most effective way to do that, and I think it will be the most effective and efficient way to do that, is just cut the funding. And then people are going to figure out something else.
Something on their own,
that they can get money for. Whether it's animal experimentation or going to private industry and Bill Gates and asking for money. But right now, the reason the animal experimentation is such a huge problem is because the government is just coughing up billions and billions of dollars a year for things that are completely stupid and unnecessary, are not actually helping anyone except the people who are getting rich doing it, with no accountability, transparency, and with and no recourse for the public historically. So we're trying to change that. We've united, the Freedom Caucus, the Squad, everyone in between on Capitol Hill to fight against this problem and say that this is not a partisan issue. It's not a left-wing liberal animal rights thing. This is something everyone cares about, and a problem that we can actually fix if we come together and find some common ground. And we're making progress. But I think that so much of the movement's focus has been on science, and we need to publish more studies showing animal experimentation doesn't work, and we need to fund alternatives. We don't need to do any of that. We've known animal experimentation is a failure for thousands of years. Even Sina, 2,000 years ago, was saying that the Persian scientist was saying animal experimentation is not going to apply to humans. I mean, people have known this forever. The evidence has been out there. The problem is the culture hasn't changed. And there hasn't been effective efforts to force the culture to change. Because ultimately this all comes down to money. That's all this is people's careers are built on animal experimentation. They don't want to have to do something else, and they don't care. So how do you make them care? You threaten their livelihood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard some stories about Harry Harlow. This guy who's a former Harlow student at the University of New Mexico. I'm forgetting his name, but he's like very anti-vivisection.
John Gluck.
Yeah, John Gluck. So I talked to John Gluck about Harry Harlow, and Harry Harlow again is this really kind of disturbing figure in animal experimentation, who's kind of the father of the National Primate Centers. Just basically taught everyone in the United States how to most efficiently and brutally reproduce, breed, and experiment on primates of various sorts. And John Gluck is an amazing and interesting figure who abandoned the field. And I don't know if you know this. Do you know he abandoned it because the ALF raided his lab?
I didn't remember that. No.
It's got to be the only case in history, because the ALF is not normally, I mean, this is not like an outreach tactic, right? Where the ALF raids your lab and they hope they convince you. His lab gets broken into. There are primates that all been rescued and they're run all over the place. And he has this like ethical crisis at that point. And actually the initial ethical crisis wasn't even the fact that he was torturing these primates. The initial ethical crisis was he was worried a bunch of the primates had a disease. It was kind of like a 28 days later scenario. He was worried these primates had a disease that could infect the people who rescued them. And he was trying to decide, should I tell people publicly that these primates had this disease that could infect them? It would kind of make my lab look bad, but it could save someone's life. And so it made him think about, like, do I care about the lives of these animal rights actors? Does it matter to me if they die? And that forced him just to reflect more about what is their perspective? What is their motivation? Why should I care about them or not care about them? And it sent him down this really interesting journey to the point that now he just recognized everything he did was horrible and wrong. So fascinating dude. And actually, I should have him on the podcast at some point because he's fascinating. And I think he'd do it. He helped us out a little bit with the Ridglan case just as a consultant. But John Gluck, I was asking him about Harry Harlow, who's this kind of legendary figure. And I was just trying to figure out, what is the psychology of this dude? How did this dude decide my mission in life is to torture as many primates as possible? Put as many, and especially primates, they're so similar to us, right? They even look like us. They got hands, they got faces that are ours. I mean, they're our evolutionary ancestors from not that long ago. You know, human beings developed as a distinct species maybe 200,000 years ago. That's not that long from an evolutionary perspective. And what he told me was, Harry Harlow just doesn't care about anyone. Like, he doesn't care about me. He doesn't even care about his students. His mission in life, this is just his mission in life. His mission in life is just, and this is like the danger of science. And it's actually funny because there's all this discussion about artificial intelligence, right? And how, imagine artificial intelligence becomes super powerful and decides it's going to turn us all into paper clips. That's kind of what Harry Harlow is. He just wants to turn the entire world into primate experiments. Because he's so like almost obsessively focused on this one mission. And he hasn't spent a moment to think about, wait, is this actually justified? Is this worth it? Because he's like a machine just focused on increasing the number of primates in labs. And it's really bizarre to me. And I think it reminds me of how our entire society, because a lot of people ask, I think you're right, that money is a big part of why the animal exploitation have gotten so big. And $20 billion, for the record, is a huge amount of money. Huge amount of money. I mean, that's like one of the largest outlays. I mean, other than things like the military and Social Security, $20 billion is pretty much as big as it gets. That's a huge amount of money. Like, I'm pretty sure $20 billion is like more than the profit of any of the top 5 tech companies. It's an enormous amount of money. But animal ag gets even more money. So in a single year I think it was in 2020, animal ag, and this is partly because of the pandemic, but it's always this high. Animal ag, just in direct outlays, I think got $46 billion. And that doesn't even account for all the other benefits they get, because they got all these perks like price supports, insurance programs that are free. Like, if you and our house burns down, the government says, oh, too bad. But for animal ag, if your barn burns down, they say like, oh, we'll build you a new one. It's like, wait, how does that work?
And the government does a lot of their R&D for them.
They do a lot of the R&D. No, absolutely.
The Agricultural Research Service and the Meat Animal Research Center, taxpayers are funding basically production research to make them more profitable.
It's absolutely insanity. It's complete insanity. But and I think what people have to understand is it's insanity driven by this obsessive engine. It is almost like an artificial intelligence. It just wants to turn anything into paper clips. Except in this case, It's like an artificial intelligence that's super powerful that wants to turn the entire world into animal experiments. That's kind of what it really is. They're just trying to turn. But the question is, and a lot of the power is driven by money, right? Because it is such an enormous amount of money. When you have that amount of money, you can like turn everything. I mean, people do the wildest things for money. I mean, go watch TikTok. The things that people are doing for money, it's wild. But I guess the thing, I actually don't even have a full story of this myself. I have a better story and a better understanding from the agricultural perspective, because the agriculture story is a fascinating one because it relates to FDR and the Great Depression, because these price supports didn't exist. All these huge subsidies, they didn't exist until the Great Depression. But back during the Great Depression, partly because people were literally starving. I mean, there are people hungry. They were having these hunger marches all over the country. You know, food was not getting to people's dinner tables. FDR started the Farm Bill, basically. And the Farm Bill became this monstrosity back at a time where most Americans were farmers. Most Americans lived on farms. At the turn of the century, 1 in 2 Americans lived on a farm. Now it's like less than 1%. So, and large numbers of Americans during the Great Depression just didn't have food. So of course we had to put huge amount of government money. How do you explain the huge amount of money into animal experiments? Like, when did this start? And like, how did we create this monstrous engine of animal exploitation that includes tens of billions of dollars funding the stupid experiments involving cats eating other cats? Do you know the history of this? How did this even start?
Yeah, in some ways, a big part of the problem, at least with the NIH budget, started in the 90s with Newt Gingrich.
Really?
The NIH budget was not nearly what it is. And he wanted the U.S. to be a leader in research. And just the NIH budget just started ballooning from there. Also, you have to think about the way the NIH, federal research money in general is laid out, is it's going to colleges and universities all across the country. So virtually every member of Congress has some college or university, some recipient.
They want the funding.
Not everyone has a farm in their district, but across the country, you have some college or university or company getting some of this money. So there's actually incentive for members of Congress to lobby, to support increasing the budget for an agency like the NIH, because they see it as increasing the tax base, creating jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, that's been the way the problem has been intensified. So historically, when you've seen budget hearings from the National Institutes of Health, everyone is just kind of kissing the ass of whoever the NIH director is. It was Francis Collins for a long time now. It's Monica Bertagnolli. But the NIH's reputation since the beginning of COVID is very different than it has been for the last 20-something years. The NIH was like the golden child of the federal government. For decades and decades, it was seen as the success story, the shining star of federal agencies in terms of, saving lives and doing innovative research. And that's now changed. And I think it's for the better, because there was a study that came out probably about 10 years ago. The NIH actually gave an award to Professor Michael Bracken at Yale. They gave him an award for his research that showed 87.5% of biomedical research is wasteful.
Wow.
So there's an enormous amount of waste, but because there's so much incentive for members of Congress, for example, to lobby and support increasing the budget, no one wanted to question whether the money coming to their district was actually being used efficiently or not. There was actually disincentive for them to do that. But that's now changed because the reputation of the NIH has changed.
Yeah. Well, let's take this back to Fauci then, because I kind of interrupt your story because I got so excited about this.
The Fauci thing's interesting too, because he did not have the power that he ended up having the last few years that people know him for. If you could look back on Fauci, 9/11 was a pivotal moment for him. Fauci's been in the government since the 80s. But after 9/11, the Department of Defense basically decided that they wanted to put him in charge of bioweapons and biodefense. So they shifted a lot of money that was being spent by the DOD, was now going through the NIH and the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Fauci's division. Wow. He was basically made the czar of biodefense, and billions were funneled in to his division at the NIH for what was essentially researching bioweapons, the creation of bioweapons. And that's
so was it
kind
offensive
of how
or defensive?
Well, that's all in the eye of the beholder, right?
Older, yeah. I mean, the gain of function research is an example of this, right? Where they say, "Oh, we're just doing this defensively," but you're actually making more dangerous viruses.
You're actually creating viruses that can be weaponized. I mean, if you look at Lyme disease, Lyme disease was something that was weaponized in the 50s by the NIH out west at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory, and they were putting it into ticks so they could drop ticks on enemies and infect them. I mean, the history of bioweapons is very scary.
Wait, so Lyme disease that's kind of out there that people get was created by the U.S. government?
It wasn't created by the U.S. government, but it was weaponized and put into ticks, and that's one of the ways. Yeah.
So it's basically spread to the West because of U.S. government program. That's terrifying. Okay, so I interrupted you in all this because you said you initially were looking at these horrible cat experiments, and then we moved to Fauci. So tell me about how you became interested in Fauci.
Yeah, so
that was a long wind-up, but it was a good wind-up.
I like it. You're building suspense. Yeah. So we start looking at what foreign labs are doing, and we, 28-19, we're running campaigns, running advertising about how there's over 300 laboratories in foreign countries that are getting NIH money for animal experiments.
Wow.
Lots of labs, Russia, China, all kinds of, Canada, UK. And then the pandemic breaks out, or it wasn't the pandemic, it was some respiratory virus was spreading in late 2019. We go to the White House in January of 2020 and had a meeting with a friend of ours. We brought a friend, Louise Linton, who was Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary's wife, big animal rights supporter. Actually, it's a vegan high fashion line.
Oh, wow.
Brought Louise to the Hill, to the White House. She got us a meeting. We met with someone at the White House, and we were like, listen, there's this virus breaking out in Wuhan, and it's coronavirus, and there's actually a laboratory there that's being funded by Dr. Fauci, where they're basically supercharging coronaviruses. And to your point earlier, these are animal experimentation. This is the reason White Coat got involved in this issue, is they were going to these bat caves, taking bats back to the laboratory, harvesting coronaviruses from those bats, supercharging those viruses, and then injecting them into humanized mice, and then watching the mice get sick and die. And they were actually tinkering with the viruses to make them intentionally make them more infectious and more deadly to humans. That's what gain of function research is. So we flagged this for the White House, and we don't hear anything about it. And we don't hear anything back from them. Finally, in April 2020,
and just for the record, Steve Mnuchin was the former Secretary of the Department of Treasury. So this is a high-level dude. So
yeah, and his wife got us a meeting at the White House. We went with her, and then met with the White House about this.
Who did you meet with at the White House? Can you say?
His name was Gary Lewandowski. He was like just some staffer they assigned to us. Yeah.
Okay. It was actually in the White House.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, anyways, you continue the story.
So we meet with them. They don't, we don't hear back from them. They just kind of gave us a cursory thank you, and that was it. We waited a few months. Nothing was happening. April 2020. If you look back, we finally go public with this, that Fauci's division at the NIH was funding these crazy animal experiments in Wuhan. And then people start putting the pieces together. Congress got involved immediately, trying to cut the grant. Within a couple days of our investigation, working with Congressman Matt Gaetz, who went on Tucker to express concern. Tucker Carlson show to express concern about this. Trump called him right after he got off TV that day and said, we need to cut this grant. How are we going to do it? Matt Gaetz called me, said, we need, Trump wants to do this. How are we going to, I gave them some recommendations on how to cut the grant. Within less than a week, Trump was on TV during the daily coronavirus briefings that he was doing back then, saying this is tremendous waste for cutting off this project, which he did.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the beginning of our work on.
So did you think back then that the coronavirus was caused by this program, or did you just think this is this weird thing that Fauci's up to near Wuhan with Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance?
We thought it was a very real possibility. I mean, people were talking already in January 2020. People like Tom Cotton, people in the intelligence community, China Hawk people were talking about this could be a lab leak. But no one was talking about, there had been no public mention at all until April 2020 when we released our report. There had been no mention at all of the fact that this lab in Wuhan was being funded by the NIH and Fauci to do these dangerous animal experiments. There was a conversation about maybe this could have been a lab leak. Because if you look back, there were a bunch of SARS outbreaks in China in the early 2000s that were as a result of lab leaks. There's actually, every week there's lab accidents in the United States where people are being exposed to or infected with viruses, including coronaviruses that had, in the years prior to COVID-19 pandemic breaking out. So, lab accidents have long been a problem. There is some evidence that there's some evidence that lots of big outbreaks that have happened have resulted from lab accidents.
Yeah.
So anyway, we thought very early on it could be.
Can I say one thing about that too? Just the number of lab accidents. A lot of these leaks are not just from labs and from farms too. And swine flu is an example of this. Like the swine flu outbreak, what was in 2009, and around the time that all this is unfolding at Wuhan with EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I don't know if you know this, but there was a very dangerous coronavirus spreading through pig farms around the country and around the world called porcine epidemic diarrhea, PED. And in every factory farm in the country, you get these signs, like these biohazard signs, PED risk. And this is a coronavirus that killed off millions and millions of pigs. They were dying all over the country. A lot of them are dying because in pigs, coronaviruses exhibit digestive instead of respiratory syndromes. It affects their digestive tract. And so all these pigs are dying of essentially diarrhea. They just could not keep food down. It was all coming out. And there was a lot of concern that minor mutations from this pig coronavirus, because pigs have a very similar immunological and biological system to human beings. This is why so many swine flus and swine viruses jump into human beings. So whether it's labs and the labs that are doing these awful experiments, a lot of them, the leaks are coming because they're grabbing all these freaking wild animals from all over the place and finding the most sick ones and then testing them. And guess what? When you find the sickest animals all over the face of the planet Earth and you mess with their viruses, humans are going to get sick. And the same thing is true of factory farms. When you confine hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of animals in a single farm, stuff them shoulder to shoulder all over the country in the most diseased, filthy conditions imaginable, guess what? Somebody's going to get sick when they come into contact with them. So it's this weird situation where this is an example of like how science is so siloed, because science recognizes there's no scientist who will tell you, oh, these aren't dangerous things, like, gain of function research or factory farms. We know these things are dangerous. Zoonotic diseases from wild animals. We know that's a dangerous thing to do. But science is not a self-directing tool, right? Science creates nuclear bombs that can blow up the world, artificial intelligence that might take over everything. It also creates cures for cancer. And it's really up to the rest of us to direct that tool in the right direction, because otherwise science can help us build even more insidious factory farms and even more dangerous viruses instead of curing cancer and helping people with their homework, So anyways, I just want to point out that it's like a very corrupt industry that is grounded very much in a very unnatural and unethical relationship with animals, just for our audience, because that's,
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, whether you thought, people believed it was from a wet market, which no one has found an animal that was infected with the coronavirus prior to humans. So, I mean, that's one of the arguments, in favor of a lab leak, because there's still no animal that was infected with COVID-19. Yet there was literally a blueprint written by people funded by Fauci to create the exact virus that ended up breaking out and killing 28 million people or something like that to date.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, it was like either way, it was people fucking with animals was the reason we got a pandemic, whether it was in the lab or wet markets. That was the common denominator through all those things. And because we were working on the wet market issue with that USDA kitten lab, we were raising alarms about both. Like, we shouldn't be sending taxpayer-funded experimenters to China to go to the wet markets and bring back infected animals. And we also shouldn't be funding these laboratories. But soon, after we saw some of the evidence coming out early on, we thought that this is more likely a lab leak. And now that's what 70% of the public believes. It's what even Joe Biden's FBI and Department of Energy believe, that this was a lab leak. And I think with the new administration, there'll be more intelligence finally declassified. That's going to lean in that direction.
Let me ask you this, because this is all. I didn't realize that you guys were on this in January, even before COVID-19 broke out, which is, that's pretty prescient of you. I mean, that's very impressive. But so COVID kind of really breaks out in China, I think, starting January, February of 2020. And then, I remember the day it shut down here because I just moved in a new apartment and I realized, I can't do anything. I can't leave this place. And in March of 2019, and for the first month and the first, frankly, year or so, Anthony Fauci and Peter, is it Daszak? I forget how to pronounce this. Like Daszak, Peter Daszak at EcoHealth Alliance, who was the actual guy who was running the program, just grabbing bats from all over China and bringing them back to Wuhan. These people are considered heroes, right? And anyone who doubts them is considered an apostate. I mean, even in the Republican Party, I feel like, Trump kind of used to stand. I remember he used to stand in those briefings with Fauci by his side and say, like, don't worry, I'm with Fauci. So just from a individual psychological perspective, you're someone who's like seeing this insidious truth about what the NIH and the NIAID, and is that right? Whatever. The organization, which is one of the biggest sub-agencies under the NIH. Just on a personal level,
they have the second largest budget other than the National Cancer Institute. They have a $6.5 billion budget. Yeah.
So what are you thinking personally? Are you already going through this weird tension that, like, what the hell's going on? The rest of the world is seeing this so differently than me.
Yeah. So COVID changed my perspective about a lot of things.
Really?
I already had a healthy degree of hate for the NIH because I've been working for 20 years on animal experimentation issues. And that's how I got my start, was exposing and shutting down an NIH-funded monkey lab, which we can talk about at some point too. But
yeah.
So NIH was always like public enemy number one as far as I was concerned. But White Coat Waste and Anthony and I personally took a lot of shit starting in April 2020. There were articles in the Washington Post. There was articles in lots of news outlets calling us right-wing conspiracy theorists and nuts and racists for suggesting that the lab leak was the cause of the pandemic. Anti-science. It always seemed to me that it was way more racist to accuse Chinese people's eating habits of causing the pandemic than a bunch of U.S.-funded scientists causing the pandemic, but that's neither here nor there. At the time, speaking out against Fauci and against the NIH was anathema, and we were criticized heavily. Some of our donors were upset. Some of our staff were uncomfortable. But as far as we're concerned, we were following the money and following the science, and this is where it was leading. And we needed to hold people accountable and get to the bottom of what really happened. What actually was going on at the time when we released the investigation in April 2020 and exposed Fauci's funding, we now know was way worse than you ever could have imagined in terms of the cover-up that was actively being coordinated by Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci and leading virologists in the world to discredit the lab leak, which they were concerned of the impact it would have on their work and their funding and their careers. And they were talking about this in emails that have now been subpoenaed and released through FOIA and congressional investigations, that all these people thought that a lab leak in February of 2020 were talking in email and Slack messages about how they thought a lab leak was very possible until they got on the phone with Fauci and he basically told them to kill this idea. And then they started publishing these papers saying a lab leak was implausible. Based on no evidence other than Fauci telling them that this is the way things need to go. We didn't know that at the time, but there was a lot of very powerful forces. Jeremy Farrar, who was the head of the Wellcome Trust at the time and is now scientific lead at WHO, Fauci, Collins, lots of people. So that was happening inside. We didn't learn that till later. But we took a lot of shit for the first year.
Just to defend Fauci, and I'm not going to defend Fauci much in this because I agree with you about him mostly. I don't think there was no evidence that it came from a wet market or from a natural leak. Because there was that, Christian Anderson paper, and I didn't understand the science completely. But it wasn't the most compelling evidence. It was based on kind of genetic markers in the virus, suggesting that it wasn't an intentional manipulation of the virus, that these kind of particular DNA traits in the virus are, I don't know enough about viruses to even remember whether it's DNA or RNA, but whatever the genetic traits were. So there was some evidence that it initially, right? But you're right that there was like discussion by Fauci and others basically saying like, hey, we need to find other evidence.
There's never been a coronavirus in this class of coronaviruses that had this spike protein. This spike protein is the thing that makes it so dangerous to you. Is that it's kind of pre-designed to attach to human receptors, and that hadn't been seen in any other virus like this before. And then we come to find out months later that a proposal to design this exact virus was written by the Wuhan lab and Peter Daszak. Like they had intended to create a virus that looked just like this. So pair that with the fact that no animal has ever been found that was infected with the virus in the market. Pair that with the fact that the people who were believed to be patient zero were people who worked in a laboratory on the Fauci-funded grant. Wall Street Journal published that based on documents we got through FOIA. So again, we don't know for certain either way. We might learn. Maybe we'll learn in the next few months when more stuff is declassified. But we believe then and believe even more strongly now that taxpayer-funded animal experiments caused the pandemic. So we were following that lead throughout 2020, and it became difficult because, the press was so hostile to us. Members of Congress, Democrats in particular, were not that friendly during that period of time either, because they thought we were going after Fauci and it was unfair. And we actually weren't even talking about Fauci at that time. We were talking about the NIH. We didn't talk about Fauci by name for many, many months, but just because we didn't think it added anything or was important. It was that the NIH did this. But when it became clear that he was more personally involved
then you
what had happened, he then became more of a central figure. And that brought us to 2021, where we started to expose more of the different types of animal experimentation that Fauci's division was funding beyond what would happen in Wuhan. So some of the laboratories here in the U.S., like the Rocky Mountain Lab out in Montana, where they do dangerous virus experiments on pigs and primates. And then ultimately we released photos and evidence of him funding dog experiments. Which is what
which went super viral.
Talking about like a half hour ago.
So actually, let me just say one thing, because I imagine there are people listening to this are pretty skeptical right now, and because I was, and I just want to say, because I remember seeing your stuff, and I always thought your stuff was really important and valuable, but when I'm living at the height of COVID-19, safety is, everybody on Facebook had that COVID-19, stay home, stay safe. We're all pro lockdown, we're all pro vaccine, we're all pro vaccine, everyone around me, my dad's a scientist. So you guys are coming out with this stuff, and I'm like, these guys are weird. I mean, I kind of dismissed it. I thought oh, they're just kind of using it. And I don't think I was offended by it, because I thought, they've got their place in the movement. That's not my place, but I didn't like it personally. I was like, this is stupid. And the two things that kind of shifted my thinking, other than I think your persistence and ultimate effectiveness and the Beagle experiments were the thing that really kind of disturbed me, because especially in the Washington Post kind of admitted they lied to the public about the experiments and about the work that you had done. And we'll talk about that in a second, because I think it's a terrible story about the mainstream media and how they lie and they just don't actually admit it. Even when they do admit it, they don't actually admit it. It's really complicated to get them to be straight with you. But the two things that made me think twice were, at some point, I remember there was discussions from you and other groups about Wuhan and these terrible animal experiments that are being performed there. And the Chinese government basically not only refused to allow anyone to look at what was happening in Wuhan, but they wiped a lot of the prior research they had published. And I was like, wait a minute. If you were actually interested in a legitimate inquiry, if you wanted to prove, if I'm innocent of something, and I know this because I've been charged many times of things, and I'm innocent, and I like talking about it. I know how the psychology of an innocent person is. No, come look. Yeah. Look at my house. I don't have a gun. I didn't kill anyone. No, I mean, look at my camera. There's, look at my GPS. Look at my phone. I wasn't where the murder happened. You want to show people when you're innocent. And China was acting very differently, like Wuhan and Peter Daszak and all these groups. They're strangely quiet and kind of, cloistering up. But the other thing was, this is many months later, but after the virus came out, and the media didn't report on this, and I have no idea why, Anthony Fauci basically admitted that he lied about the vaccine, just straight up. And the specific lie, and this might seem like a fairly minor detail, was about the threshold that's required for herd immunity. Right. So he basically said, I lied to the public and said a lower percentage is required to take the vaccine because I thought it would encourage more people to take the vaccine. And that was a point for me. It was This is a huge deal. Like a public health official in the middle of a pandemic admitting that he's lying to the public in order to convince them to do something he wants them to do. And why is there not more accountability? Why isn't there more inquiry in this? And the New York Times had this story about it that made it seem like, oh, that's so funny. You lied to everyone. And to me, and actually, I talked to a lot of medical doctors because I have some friends who are professors at UCSF. And I asked them about this. I was like, this seems like a big deal that he just outright lied. And it wasn't a small lie. It was like, he was saying, oh, I think herd immunity is like 60%. And he was like, actually, it's 90%. I just lied. And they were all just aghast too, and just said, this seems really disturbing. This isn't science. This is just manipulation. And the fact that science can be used to manipulate people and that there can be so little accountability, even in a case where millions of Americans were dying and where, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested into major projects, like the fundamental principle of democracy is ruled by the people. And the people can only rule if we are not manipulated and lied to. And that rule was being violated by Fauci in this very, very important way. And that actually, interestingly, made me way more open to some of these other things that you're talking about. And it's really weird to me because in many ways, I more than anyone else should be doubtful of government institutions because the government's been chasing me around for like the last 10 years. But I think even the government literally sent FBI agents all over the country chasing after 2 piglets that I rescued. I mean, so it's like insane. But I was always just under the impression that, oh no, I'm having these weird experiences, but it's just in my area. It's just because the crazy FBI agents and the crazy USDA are doing these wild things because they're embedded in the industry. And then your work was one piece of opening a bigger puzzle for me, which is like, wait a minute, it's not just the USDA. It's kind of the entire US government is like this. And that's super scary to think that. But you opened my eyes to that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I a lot of people had a cognitive dissonance about Fauci and the government.
Yeah, they did.
Especially at that time when you're kind of scared. People were at the mercy of the government for their life. Yeah, what is safe to do and not to do, and do I get the vaccine, and if so, how many boosts? Like people were just relying on experts, and then you come to realize that these experts may have some other agenda. They might be abusing their authority in some way. I mean, to your point, like I said earlier, I've been doing this for 20 years. Very early on, early 2000s, the FBI was following me and coming to my house when I was a graduate student, just because I was effectively running a good grassroots and media campaign against a government-funded animal lab. There's a file on me, just them coming to our protests and monitoring my activity. We never did anything illegal. Yeah, it was all above board. I was constantly talking to the press, inviting the press to come into everything we did. There was nothing even happened. Nothing even happened that was illegal that they were trying to pin me to. They were just concerned that I was asking the right questions and being effective. Yeah. And so I think I had a less of a difficult time than other people when COVID came around. I thought, are there powerful people abusing their authority to promote their agenda? And again, White Coat Waste has no interest at all in anything except animal experimentation. Masks, vaccines, lockdowns, whatever. That wasn't of interest to us. Yeah. That wasn't our interest. It wasn't my interest personally. And that had nothing to do with our criticism of Fauci. It had to do with his funding of this laboratory and then lying about it. Yeah. And you come to learn that that's exactly what was happening. Is he did fund this laboratory, and experts in the Trump and Biden administrations think that that's what caused the pandemic. And not only that, these people who were lionized in April 2020, like Peter Daszak, after we exposed him, 60 Minutes had him on saying he's basically a hero, and us cutting the grant and Trump cutting the grant was going to kill people. He just got debarred. The Biden administration they're in the process of permanently cutting them off from federal funding because of all their lies and corruption and mismanagement of their grant in Wuhan. So a lot of things that were conspiracy theories 4 or 5 years ago are now conspiracy facts. Now the more evidence has come out, and I'm proud that we kind of were aggressive and leaned into what we thought was right at the time, because a lot of other groups, later were willing to criticize Fauci, and after we had, no one was criticizing Fauci. Then all of a sudden, PETA and some other groups were coming out and naming and shaming him. But no one was criticizing Fauci. Everyone was afraid to, because he was a hero to so
it's so
many
powerful.
people. And they were afraid of being alienated. And we took a lot of shit. We were constantly criticized in the media. There were hit pieces about us in the Post and all kinds of other publications. There were FEC complaints filed against us for criticizing Fauci, just going after us. That were enormously expensive to defend against. And they were completely baseless.
Yeah.
Just because we criticized Fauci and were causing people to ask questions.
Yeah.
And ultimately helped uncover wrongdoing that might have killed lots of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been such a weird turnaround with Daszak and Fauci, right? Because they were considered such heroes. I remember there were so many people. At one point, I think there was this meme going around that was just like Fauci with a halo around his head, and it said, "In Fauci we trust." You know, like he's God and Jesus. Do you think internally, in your observations of Fauci and Daszak, do you think they were worried this was all going to come out? Like, because I had no idea when I was watching him, you know, in all these press briefings of Trump, like standing next to him saying like, "I'm here to save you from COVID." I thought he was a hero, and I thought he thought he was doing good work. And so I guess my question is, do you think he's actually just completely delusional and still thinks to this day, I'm doing all these wonderful things for the world, including the animal experiments? Or do you think inside there was a tension that he knew kind of he was an imposter?
That's a great question. I mean, I think he thinks he's misunderstood by people.
Huh.
But there's emails from early 2020 where he and Francis Collins, who was the director of the NIH, basically, the quote is almost exactly, possibly exactly, "We have to kill this dangerous conspiracy theory about the lab leak."
Yeah.
They were very motivated to exonerate themselves and to kill any suggestion that something they had done caused the pandemic. I mean, Fauci's on the record a decade ago saying gain of function research, the risk is worth taking. You know, he wrote a piece, he and Collins wrote a piece in the Washington Post about that because people were concerned over a decade ago that this exact outcome might happen.
Yeah.
And then it did. So, of course, you don't want that. I mean, people have been warning against it for a long time, and then the worst case scenario came true. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I still think he thinks he did the right thing, even if the outcome is what it is. I think he thinks it was a risk worth taking.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this just reminds me of this concept of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt conceived of, which is we often think that evil is inflicted by people who are these, you know, manipulative, conniving, the Mr. Burns types going like, yes, you know, and oftentimes it's actually kind of in some ways well-meaning people are just a little deluded. You know, it just becomes normalized that this evil is okay, whether it's gain of function research, animal experimentation, or animal agriculture. Just these things that, like, all of us on some level, if we thought about it, knew. I mean, I'm always struck by the fact that, like, the investigations we do, there's just no one who can watch an animal being scalded alive. You know, I've literally shown people footage of dogs, chickens, cows, pigs, all sorts of animals being scalded alive. It just happens all the time because, you know, the stun rate failure at a slaughterhouse is maybe like 12%, in a cattle slaughterhouse, probably higher in a chicken slaughterhouse. It's kind of shockingly high. And a lot of those animals end up going into scalding hot water tank. I mean, this is just like medieval torture, just the most brutal, vile sort of stuff. And it happens all the fucking time. And there's just no one, even like farmers, even in places like rural Utah, who looks at this and says, oh, that seems okay to me. Like, in fact, it's so horrifying, people don't even look at it. And yet we all participate in it. And we all, like, support the government, these industries that are doing it. And it's because it's just so deeply normalized, right? And I think my sense is, like, with people like Fauci, and my dad too, you know, like my dad, he didn't directly hurt animals beyond his first couple of years. Like, he had to decapitate little mice. He's told me these horrible stories about how, like, his PI, his principal investigator, basically his boss when he was a grad student, would force him to, like, grab a mouse and taught him to basically take a pair of scissors and just cut a mouse's head off with this very sharp pair of scissors. Like, he had to do that physically. And it was like the most horrifying thing he'd ever done in his life. Because this is a very kind person. He's like the person more than anyone else in my life who's taught me just to be generous to everyone around me. And he went into science because he wanted to try and help people. And this is one of the things he was taught to do when he was a grad student. He had never done it before. But it was just like all these authority figures would tell me I have to do this. If I want to help people, I have to do this. I guess it's justified. Again, I don't look into this because I'm not someone who's researching whether decapitating mice is good for science. I'm researching metabolic disease, and people are telling me this is just part of it. So I guess I have to do it. And I think this is kind of it's one of the great opportunities, but it's also one of the great mysteries of exploitation and oppression. That it's an opportunity because if it isn't just evil people, then there's hope for humanity, right? That if we could just show people that this is, even Fauci, if we could show food, if we could just like shake Fauci and say like, dude, you don't have to do this. Like, see the light, come see the light, realize that you don't have to torture these poor dogs. But it's a mystery because even though I think this has been true, so many historical periods of atrocity. And Hannah Arendt was writing about the Holocaust. I mean, she was writing about how these German soldiers, like she went to the trials at Nuremberg, and she wrote The Banality of Evil. Actually, The Banality of Evil is a concept. I think it's the name of the book is, I forget what the name of the book is, but there's a book where she conceives of this concept. But she writes about how all the generals and the perpetrators of the Holocaust, when you read their journals, you wouldn't even realize they're evil people. They just sound like bureaucrats. They're like, yeah, today I had lunch with my wife and I had an objective to try and hit 97% of our objective today at Auschwitz. And you don't even realize he's talking about 97% of the people he's going to murder, right? He wants to murder. It's something like that. And it's so banal. It's just so like the meaning of banal is just normalized. It's just so normal you don't even think about it. And yeah, I don't know. It's scary, but what are we going to do? But
Well,
actually,
I
you
think
show
you're
us
right.
what we can do, because I think you did turn the tables on Fauci. Interestingly, not even directly on COVID. I think it really started this Beagle stuff.
It was, and it's interesting. 2021 comes along. We release this investigation of this Beagle testing. So a paper was published in summer of 2021 by these experimenters in Tunisia and Ohio State University, involving biting sandfly experiments on beagles. And in this project, they took these beagle puppies, sedated them, and then they locked their heads in mesh cages full of biting flies. And they actually starved the flies so they're hungry. And then they put the flies in the mesh cage with the beagles' heads and faces, because that's where it's most easy for them to access the beagle's blood, by biting their ears and their face. And if you've ever had a dog and they cut their ear or something, the bleeding is like,
it's terrible,
wild. Yeah. So that's what they want to do with the experiment. Not only do they publish this paper citing Fauci's division of NIH as the funding source, the paper includes a photograph, which is now kind of infamous and went viral, of the experimental setup of the beagles. So we released this investigation, and actually nothing comes of it for a couple months.
Really?
Some conservative press covered it.
Huh.
And nothing comes of it. And then we released a second investigation of another Fauci-funded project where they debarked beagles in a drug toxicity test. And in the paper they described, or in the grant documents we got, they had a line item. I mean, talk about banality of evil. They have a line item on the budget that says devocalization.
Yeah.
And so they cut the puppies' vocal cords so they don't bark in the lab, and then they were essentially poisoning them with experimental drugs. We released that one. Democrats and Republicans signed a letter sending it to Fauci saying, what the fuck is going on? This is crazy. We want you to stop these experiments.
Was this the Nancy Mace letter?
Nancy Mace and Ted Lieu led this letter in October of 2021.
Strange bedfellows. Bedfellows.
Exactly.
Anyways, so Nancy Mace she's going viral right now about the anti-trans stuff. But anyways.
Yeah. People are not one-dimensional.
They're not one-dimensional.
Yeah. So, so they write this letter and it starts picking up speed, that Democrats and Republicans alike were going after Fauci. So it was a bipartisan criticism of Fauci. Somehow, and I remember the exact article that did this, an article in The Hill, the DC publication The Hill, wrote about this new letter, but also weaved in our earlier investigation of the dogs with their heads in the mesh cages. And because there was a photo attached to that one, it kind of all got conflated at the time. But anyway, this picture went viral. I remember standing in Lowe's with my wife, the hardware store. We were in the process of moving or buying a new house, and my phone starts blowing up. Joe Rogan and Donald Trump Jr. had shared this story.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my God, what's this thing's breaking. It's amazing. It's really caught fire. So people start tweeting, Fauci kills beagles, Donald Trump Jr. selling T-shirts, Fauci lied, puppies died, all this stuff happens. So after not saying anything for 2 months after our first investigation, then the story goes viral. It's covered everywhere. We get a call from the Washington Post saying we're going to do some coverage of this, but the NIH tells us they didn't fund this study. We're like, that's strange. This paper's been out for months. These guys get NIH grants. This specific paper cites NIH grant numbers as the funding source. And if you go on the NIH database and look up this grant, this paper is listed under it as one of the outcomes of this grant. And they said NIH is denying that they funded this. And I'm like, well, of course they're now denying it because they are in fucking hot water. So they're trying to distance themselves from it. But without any evidence at all, just the word of the NIH, the Washington Post runs several stories saying that we basically lied and the NIH never funded this and we are just on some anti-Fauci crusade. There was a cover story.
Tying you to the right wing. And I remember this story and I was super troubled by it too. Accusing you basically of trying to kill Fauci because it was all about like, oh, Fauci's getting death threats. People are trying to kill Fauci. And it was
There
so
was a
wild.
cover story on the Sunday Washington Post above the fold that said something to the effect, the term they used was fake Beagle research claim. Now remember, the experimenters themselves cited Fauci as the funding source. NIH then denied it. And with no evidence at all,
just the government's word.
They just said Fauci and NIH said they didn't fund it. Then they run this story saying they got 3,000.
Can I just add something for our audience?
Yes, please.
This happens all the time with the government and the media. The government says something that you have overwhelming evidence is not true, and the media still says you're the liar. And it is like, I hate using the term gaslighting because it's like so overused and it's like everything's become gaslighting. But I have never felt more gaslit than in interfacing with the US government on animal issues. The way they outright lie and the way the media believes it. And then you have to, when you're the one exposing their lies, you have to turn around. I mean, I could tell you so many stories. I'm dealing with a case right now with his judge in the government are trying to convince me I had a trial and I didn't have a trial. And I know I didn't have a trial. They're basically trying to hold me liable. I'm not going to go into this story, but they're trying to hold me liable for $300,000 for rescuing 2 turkeys in this suit, right? They sued me for these 3. And they're trying to convince me, oh, you had a trial. And it's like, no, I didn't have a trial. There was no trial. You can't do this to someone. You can't just hold them liable. And this is just a little example, but it's so egregious and stupid. And then you have like media outlets saying like, yeah, you didn't have a trial. I mean, like, no, I just because the government says I had a trial doesn't mean I had a trial. Like I literally didn't have a trial. And people won't believe this. They say like, no, this is the United States of America. You can't just be held guilty of something without having a trial. That's due process. No, you can. And the government can just say it and it doesn't matter because the government bureaucrat, it's like Kafka. If you've ever read The Trial by Kafka, Kafka was this existentialist writer who's writing about how bureaucracies have gotten out of control. And it's about this trial this guy's going through, and he has no idea what he's being tried for. He comes to court every day and like they direct him to different rooms. He has no idea what's going on. And it's like working with the government so often is like this. And it does create like this, deep distrust in these institutions when you go through experiences like these. And it sounds like you had a similar one with the NIH, but I just want to say that because when I saw that story, I was like, I know exactly what's happening right now. The NIH is lying and the Washington Post just believes them because it's the government saying it. And the government can just like distort reality. They can just dictate the truth for all of us.
And it wasn't just the government. It was Fauci.
Yeah, he
did. He was like a singular figure at the time.
Yeah, he was.
So they're saying the experimenters accidentally cited the NIH funding, even though these guys are funded by the NIH for dog experiments specifically.
Yeah.
In this particular instance that is now very controversial and being criticized, they actually didn't use the money from us. So that's what they're saying. Yeah. And the Post believes, or I don't even know if it doesn't matter if the Post believes it. The Post prints this and they say the NIH says that they were cited in error as the funding source.
Mm-hmm.
There was no alternative funding source ever provided. It was just that the NIH was accidentally cited. And eventually they get the guy who did the experiment saying, yeah, it was an accident. So the Post runs a story saying that the NIH got 3,000 phone calls. Fauci got 3,000 phone calls in a couple days. They interviewed me at length. They were saying, don't you think you're interfering with COVID response and people are going to die because you're criticizing Fauci over dog testing? Anyway, so this goes on, but this then catches fire on mainstream media about this fake Fauci story. You could see all these high-profile people saying that this is a lie, all these Washington Post reporters saying we were essentially a right-wing hate group that had some vendetta for Fauci. We submit FOIA requests. We're like, what was going on in the NIH? First thing we get back is the actual grant application. Lo and behold, it describes the exact experiment that is that is depicted in the study. Okay, so we release that. Send it to the Washington Post. No one cares.
Yeah. That's wild. That's so wild. They just don't care about the truth sometimes.
Yeah. Don't care. Send that, don't care, put that out. Then the people who believed us, which is basically half the country at that time, is like, okay, we believed it in the first place. This is more evidence that the government was lying. We keep submitting requests to Ohio State University, to the NIH. We wanted all the correspondence they had with the Washington Post and internally about this when it happened. We finally get this all in the door. We had to sue the NIH through FOIA. And this summer, Fauci finally appeared in front of Congress in an oversight hearing. And our friends, Congresswoman Nicole Maliotakis, Republican from New York, who's the co-chair of the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, both hammered Fauci. Marjorie Taylor Greene showed the photo.
Yeah, she showed a photo. I saw that.
She waved the photo around.
As director of the NIH, you did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil, what you signed off on, and these experiments that happened to beagles paid for by the American taxpayer. And I want you to know Americans don't pay their taxes for animals to be tortured like this.
What does dogs have to do with anything that we're talking about today?
This happens. The Post fact checker calls me. Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post calls me and he says, hey, we're going to run, or emails me. He says, we're going to run a story. Why are you still putting out this fake news essentially about Fauci funding this dog experiment? Why is Marjorie Taylor Greene still accusing him of this? And I said, oh, funny you write, Glenn, because we have all of these emails.
Yeah, we've got the receipts.
That we hadn't released yet showing that when that story went viral, Fauci emailed all his senior staff and said, what the hell is going on here? And within hours, they had the animal experimenter who did the study with no evidence, admitting or saying, going along with the story, yeah, maybe this was an accident. And within the same day, they went from funding this thing on paper to telling the Washington Post we had nothing to do with it and the Post running the story.
Yeah.
And there was no evidence that it was ever accidentally charged to this grant or anything like that. It just miraculously appeared. Baseless. The baseless claim that they didn't fund it was manufactured at the NIH. The Washington Post ran with it, no questions asked. And even days later, the Post came back and said, hey, do you have any evidence that this actually happened? The NIH said no to the Post.
No,
So Glenn Kessler, we hand him all this evidence, and he writes this story, basically saying we got it wrong. The NIH did have some role in this, and they weren't honest with us, and they covered it up. None of the original reporting has been corrected. None of the reporters who wrote all those hit pieces about us shared the story. The Post did not share the story on social media.
Yeah, it was like super quiet. I had to I think it was someone sent it to me. Do you know Leighton Woodhouse?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, Leighton's a great guy. He's a good friend of mine.
He wrote it up. Yeah.
Yeah, he sent me the gun class piece and he said, you should check this out. I was like, yep, this doesn't surprise me at all, given my interactions with the government. The thing, so just to get some facts that are undeniable on the table here, it's undeniable the labs received money from the NIH, right? So that happened. The question is, what's the money's for? It's undeniable that the grant did describe experiments like this, right? But the thing that actually disturbed me the most was one of the talking points in the Washington Post. I will say Glenn Kessler, he had enough integrity to at least acknowledge there were some errors, but it's like a very wishy-washy piece. It's not like we effed up big time. This should have been like weapons of mass destruction level catastrophe where people getting fired. And, there's a reexamination of the Post reporting practices. But the detail that was most insidious to me was this grant database, this public grant database, which a lot of different groups use. I've used it. Use all these databases to do your research. The NIH at the time when this story broke, they claimed that this grant did not appear. There was no grant in the database as a basis for saying the NIH didn't fund this study. And it turns out it's because they removed it.
Yeah.
They deceived. They covered it up. They removed the database knowing that they had removed it. Then they went to the media and they said, look, well, if we funded it, why isn't it in the database? And they didn't say to the Post, oh, it's not in the database because we just removed it intentionally and manually, which is super manipulative. And again, as a lawyer who's done a lot of criminal cases, and I started my work in doing criminal defense work even before I was a lawyer, defending people who actually were guilty. Like a lot of people on death row who were guilty, I just didn't think they should be killed by the state for whatever crimes they commit. But there's a difference between the people who are genuinely innocent and they actually do. Again, like the people on death row are innocent. They're like, please, will someone look at my case? Please, for the love of God, someone look at the facts. I didn't do it. And then there are people who are like, yeah, just can you not kill me? I've done good things. They're like, don't look too deeply into the case. And we all know this. Like you and I, all of us to some level do this. We tend, when we make a little mistake, we're like, oh, because you're ashamed of it. You don't want to show people. Well, when you're innocent, you actually want to show people. And the fact that the NIH was doing things like this, removing the grant from the database and then going to the media and claiming, oh, it's just not there. You don't do that sort of shit when you actually think you're right, when you actually are innocent. You don't have to cover up your trail because your trail will lead people to the truth, which is that you're innocent. In this case, they covered it up, and that's super messed up. That is super messed up, and it should make all of us distrust the institutions that run the country today, in my view.
I agree with you, and it's also, the federal agencies and the mainstream media work hand in glove to do these things, though.
They do,
because when we got the emails from the Post when they were looking for comment from the people who were responsible for the experiments, and the emails open up not as some objective reporter trying to get the truth. The email opens, I am a Washington Post reporter who is writing a story about White Coat Waste's disinformation campaign against Anthony Fauci. Basically, can you confirm what I want to say in this story? And of course, they say yes. So it's really a coordinated effort. It's very clear from all the emails we got through the Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the NIH that the Washington Post and the NIH were coordinating to do this, to counterattack against us. And we had the wherewithal, and I credit Anthony, my boss, for this, because we went to Glenn Greenwald and Leighton Woodhouse before the story came out when we first heard it was happening. Like they were digging into our finances. They wanted to expose something that's not
they wanted
true,
to bring you down.
that we were some right-wing front group. I wish we were getting dark money from left, right, wherever. We'd love to have it. We'd love to have it. It's not there. But they were digging into our finances, trying to tie us to some boogeyman.
Yeah.
I mean, we are genuinely people trying to stop animal experiments. That is our mission. That is our goal. That is our life's work, is trying to stop animals from being tortured in experiments. That's our only mission. That's our only agenda. We have none other than that. But we went to Glenn and Leighton, and they ran a great piece basically about the Washington Post's coordinated attack to discredit us to protect Fauci. And it blunted a little bit and pre-butted and preempted a little bit what the Post ultimately did, but the Post ran it on the cover of their paper, and lots of people read that and believed it, and probably still believe it to this day.
Yeah. Have you had any interaction with the original journalist at the Post who wrote this story, this hit piece? I see Beth Reinhardt. Did you talk to Beth Reinhardt or Yasmin
Abu Talib? I've tried. I've emailed them, and I've tagged them.
Which is what an innocent person does, right?
There's a lot of Twitter strings with me screenshotting their original reporting, and then Glenn's later reporting. Glenn Kessler's later reporting, and nothing. They haven't taken their tweets down. They haven't issued a correction or retracted anything they ever said.
Yeah. Which one did you actually talk to? Was there one that you're working directly with?
I talked to Yasmin and Beth on the phone at length.
Both of them. Okay. Interesting. And what do you think the psychology is there? Do you think they're just like true believers? And I mean, I guess you don't know because they're not even willing to talk to you.
No, I think they were true believers. Like it was very clear from the conversation we had that they were on Team Fauci, and they wanted to take
To
down
bring you down.
anybody who dared to criticize him because he was trying to save the world, and we were interfering with that with disinformation. But it turns out the disinformation came from the NIH.
Yeah, and unfortunately from the Washington Post too. In this case, so I have always been a huge believer in the mainstream media, and I've been a subscriber to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal actually for most of my adult life. I read the New York Times every single day. I've been a hobbyist journalist. Like I took newspaper when I was in high school. I wrote a column for the University of Chicago Student Maroon. I interned at CNN, so I've always been part of the mainstream media. And again, I did not realize how broken the institution was until we tried to break our first story where we're going up against a powerful person. And I think the mainstream media probably does a pretty good job in areas where there isn't distortion caused by power, the government, a big company. But our first story at the New York Times, so we went into a Whole Foods egg farm and found that contrary to what Whole Foods is marketing, none of these birds are going outside. They had all these like beautiful images of like literally a little girl playing with a chicken outside, on the egg cartons. And you really think, oh, I feel like I'm donating to a sanctuary when I buy these eggs. You don't realize there's a huge factory farm where animals are like eating each other alive, disease, trampling over each other. Some of them just basically buried in piles of feces, slowly dying for starvation because they're so sick and it's just horrible shit. And so we have all this disturbing footage, and we go to the New York Times, and the New York Times kind of has to run the story because this was the first expose of Whole Foods, and Whole Foods was huge. I mean, it's still big now, but back in 2014, like Fortune magazine had a front page cover saying Whole Foods is taking over America. It's like the natural foods revolution was really happening. John Mackey was getting interviewed. Everyone was like a hero of American foods. And I kid you not, they eventually do run the story. But even though our investigation was the reason the story even existed, the only thing they linked to in terms of evidence in the story that ran online was Whole Foods response video, which was like it was like such a sham video. It was like, so basically the farm set up this little porch outside of their factory farm. This is a farm that has like 1 million chickens, and they had like 2 chickens on a little porch, and it wasn't even outdoors. It was like a little porch with like a fenced in area, like that only like a couple chickens could sit in. I mean, it was like the size of this table. It was not very large. And they showed that video footage and said, here's the farm. And I was like, wait a minute, this entire story was supposed to be about our investigation. You didn't show any of our photos and video. You didn't even link to our video. All you linked to was our response, is their response. And, it's just so disturbing. And in many ways, I think the only way you can combat the distorting effect of power is to create power that fights back against it. And I think that's kind of what you did with the Fauci story. Like, the only way you're able to combat the disinformation of the government that the mainstream media bought into was to create power yourselves that could push back against it. And then, 3 years later, the Washington Post and Glenn Kless have to write this other story, which is not even a real mea culpa. You read the story, it's like, it's kind of it's a very weak mea culpa.
Yeah.
The other question I had for you, and then I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, so I'll let you go soon. But how did Glenn Kessel respond? Because he writes to you, and he wants to write this, basically a follow-up hit piece, right? About how, I can't believe you're in bed with Marjorie Taylor Greene. You're corrupt and evil just like her. Tell me how stupid you are. And then you show him evidence. No, actually, you guys just lied about us for years. And to his credit, he does basically agree with you in a very weak way, and the Post didn't promote it. But what was his psychology in talking to him? Did you feel like he was an honest person? Did you feel like he was like seeing the problem with the original reporting, or?
Yeah, I give him a lot of credit.
Really?
Because I'm sure, listen, I never expected anything like that to happen at all.
Wow.
Like, I never expected the Post to revisit the story. I thought it was done. They had on Beaglegate, I think there were 2 big pieces they ran about it.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of lab leak stuff, but I never thought they'd revisit it. So he was open to it. I sent him the documents. He asked a lot of great follow-up questions, and then wrote his piece, which I think was the best we could have expected from the Washington Post, given the circumstances.
Yeah.
But I think he ended up being
the Washington Post.
Very.
I read it. I was upset about the piece because I felt like he kind of buried the lead, which is the Washington Post lied back in 2021. But anyways.
You know what, though? No one reads anything, and people read headlines, and we promoted it the way that, truthfully, which is the Post is basically admitting that they were misled by the NIH. and that we were right, which is true. I mean, he does say that in there. He does,
the
say
post was misled.
Yeah. So no, I give him credit for being interested enough and honest enough to do it.
That's good.
And publishing the piece, and I bet he took a lot of shit from his colleagues for it.
Oh, I'm sure he did.
So, but I, a lot of what we do, I mean, I think this is the case in general, as I think a lot of decisions made, this isn't true of you, and I give you a lot of credit for this. I think a lot of decisions made in the movement are made out of fear. I think they're made out of fear of what other people are going to think, what the industry is going to think, what opposition is going to think, what the press is going to think, instead of doing what's right and leaning into it and bringing people along with you. And, I think we've made a lot of difficult decisions over the past 5 years, especially with the Fauci stuff, with Beaglegate, with working with literally anybody on Capitol Hill who will be helpful, because I know that we need all the help we can get. Animals need all the help they can get. And if I have to work with members of Congress who have completely different worldview than I do, but believe, we're on the same page about this one thing, regardless of what the reason is, I'm going to do that, because I care about getting things done and being effective and not being necessarily right or being liked by people or pure. I don't care about any of that. And I think that's been such an impediment to the movement for so long, is being pure and being worried about what people think instead of doing the right thing and what's effective. And also being caught up in the echo chamber of listening to, the tiny sliver of people who are actually vegan zealots, which is not the public at large. It's like a tiny fringe of society. Whether or not there's common ground between that group of people and the rest of society when it comes to certain things, most people don't have that worldview. So we need to find common ground and not criticize, and be grateful when people agree with us about anything. But I think that's a challenge for people who care about animals in general, is overcoming some of that fear, and I think animals will be better off if they will, and I think the work we've done is proof of that.
100%. I think there's a chance that the campaign we've had against Ridglan and the receptivity that the government has had to our arguments, and frankly, to be blunt, the fear the DA has about pursuing this case has been partly driven by your successes with these Beagle projects, and because it's just been in the media so much that, even people on the left now. I wish people on the left had been supportive of you back in 2020. I wish I had been supportive of you back in 2020. I was supportive in the sense that I wasn't against it. I was just like, that's kind of weird, don't go after Fauci. Maybe that's such a good idea. But I think there has been some pretty big cultural change around animal experimentation in the last 3 or 4 years. And jump in there.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that one of the things that changed is that we made animal testing high politics. Animal testing was the excommunicated weird relative before, that once in a while got some press and a member of Congress would talk about. Now there's members of Congress running campaign ads about it, running social media campaigns for re-election about it. It's in the press constantly. There's, hearings revolving around this issue. There's legislation being advanced and passed and enacted. It's just part of popular culture now, in a way that it wasn't before. And that is because of what happened in Wuhan and gain of function and Beaglegate. I think the success of the Envigo case, and we worked on that a little bit, but if you look at after post Envigo, what people were talking about, a lot of it, especially the press that it got in the center and right, was all tied to Fauci. It was all that Fauci, Fauci's labs were buying these Beagles, and the NIH was buying these Beagles. It wasn't Envigo in a vacuum, because Envigo and places like Envigo and Ridglan have been around for a long time. But it was creating this cultural shift that all of a sudden this issue was salient and people were paying attention to it. So,
and Envigo, can you just explain to the audience what Envigo is? Because a lot of people will know because they follow the podcast. But what is Envigo and what happened in Envigo?
Envigo is like a Ridglan. It's a commercial puppy mill that breeds Beagles specifically for animal experimentation by the thousands. I think at the time when Envigo first started being cited by the U.S. government for violations, there were 5,000 beagle puppies at this basically essentially a warehouse in Virginia. And after a series of investigations, the DOJ shut them down and 4,000 beagles were rehomed. Half of those beagles were rehomed and adopted out by our friends at the Kindness Ranch in Wyoming, who actually we're doing a congressional briefing with next week about beagle and cat testing issues.
That's awesome.
But yeah, there's still other companies like that out there. I mean, when I talk about animal testing being big business, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, it's the animal experimenters, it's the people who make the cages, it's the people who make the food, it's the people who make the companies that make the restraint devices that transport the animals, that breed thousands of puppies, that breed and import monkeys, that breed kittens, that breed tens of millions of mice and rats. I mean, they're all getting rich off torturing animals. So it is a massive industry, and that's who we're up against. And their biggest customer is the federal government. So when I look at this issue, when White Coat Waste look at this issue, the government is the enemy. I think a lot of the other groups, other organizations working on this issue look at government as a solution. You know, we need more regulations, or we need stronger laws, or whatever. The government can intervene, but actually the government is the enemy when it comes to this issue. They're the market maker. They're the one creating these grant programs and giving these contracts and funding these experiments and buying these animals. They're forcing us to pay for it. So that's the funding stream that has to get shut off. And that's the way we're going to get the most animals out of laboratories, is simply cutting the funding, because no private organizations are going to foot the bill for like zombifying kittens and making them walk on treadmills, or or infesting beagles with ticks and biting flies, or giving monkeys brain damage and scaring them with fake snakes and spiders, which is a project at the NIH that we exposed. I mean, it's just not going to happen. No one's going to pay for that because there's no return on investment. It doesn't have anything to do with human health. It's not going to make them money in some other way. So that's why we take, as far as we're concerned, the government is the target. People like Anthony Fauci, who are responsible for funneling billions of dollars into animal testing, are the ones we need to be targeting and changing the opinion or attitudes or actions of. And we work, we do grassroots work. We do a ton of press work, as you know, and we're on the Hill with right wing and left wing and progressive and conservative and libertarian members of Congress who, for one reason or another, want to cut funding for animal experimentation. And that's why we are we're cautiously optimistic about the new administration and the GOP-led Congress coming in, because people taking leadership roles in the House and the Senate, like Lisa McClain, Republican from Michigan, she is the incoming chair of the House GOP. She has been one of the greatest leaders over the past several years on cutting taxpayer-funded animal experiments, leading bills, leading letters, leading funding efforts to cut money for animal experiments. Joni Ernst is, in leadership in Senate now and part of the DOGE caucus. Marjorie Taylor Greene, lots of these people. Like I said earlier, Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, was a great supporter and advocate for cutting funding for dog and cat testing at the VA when he was in Congress. He's a veteran. So there's a lot of people who have who have the right bona fides, who've really been great leaders on our issue since we started 8 years ago, who now have positions where they could really make sweeping changes. And I think there's obviously receptivity with people like Elon and Vivek and, Trump's whole family. Eric, Don Jr., Laura Trump are all White Coat Waste supporters. They've all done work with us in one way or another. So I've never been more enthusiastic about the people running the government to actually do the right thing than I am now. And it's not because I agree with them about everything. It's because they agree with us about this one thing, and we're going to try to capitalize on it as much as possible.
Yeah, this success you've had really makes me optimistic about the future of animal rights. And it also shows how quickly things can change, because you went from being, like, in many ways, the nation's pariah, or at least in places like California, to really seizing the agenda in a very powerful way, where, again, even in places like Madison, Wisconsin, or San Francisco, California, even in places like Silicon Valley, the tide is really turning against animal experimentation. And I think we'll see the end of the use of dogs in experiments, and maybe soon an end to animal experimentation because of the work you've done. Here's a tough question for you. Do you think that same success can be achieved for animals used for food in say the next 20 years?
No.
Really? Say why.
Well, I think the nature of the issue is very different, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of the, one criticism I have of the movement is that we lump everything together and we, animal abuse for X, Y, and Z industry, and we should end all of it. And I think the issues are just so different. So animal experimentation, for example, people don't have no personal connection to it. They don't know people who do it. They're not personally doing it. They have some physical and psychological distance that makes it easier to criticize and oppose without any type of cognitive dissonance, which is a good thing for the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think food issues are very, very different. And I haven't seen evidence that we can make that type of progress. How many more investigations do you need to see of pigs and chickens and other animals being tortured? Or how good do the meat alternatives have to be? I mean, I haven't seen anyone crack the code yet. It doesn't mean it's not possible.
Yeah.
But I just think the nature of the issue is different. The psychology of it is different. Changing people's behavior is very, very difficult. And also you have the fact that this industry is incredibly powerful, and it's going to be hard to force change.
Yeah, it's definitely bigger. And even if you just look at the subsidies, and we talk about $20 billion in animal testing, I mean, on an annual basis, you're probably looking at least $100 billion in total benefits and of the U.S. government. And instead of just a kind of a vice-like grip on our government that lasts a few decades, we're talking about hundreds of years. I mean, even before FDR, right? You have, the founding fathers, in many ways, slavery was the result of the farming industry's power, right? Because it was a plantation industry. And there were a lot of people, even among the founding fathers, who had deep discomfort for slavery, but they're like, yeah, we kind of need it to grow crops, so we're going to keep doing it. So like even our willingness to torture other human beings, to benefit this industry, I think you're wrong though. And I asked you that question partly because I just wanted to prompt for my own soapbox. Because I've been doing lots of animal issues for a long time. And I think in the last 5 years, and people won't be surprised by this, and you're not seeing this in consumer level data yet, but there's been a pretty big sea change in the way elites, the way ordinary people receive farm animal issues. And I think part of it is, I think you're right, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in food issues that you don't see in experimentation issues, but it's partly because of our framing. That if we can shift away from like if you're not vegan, you're scum framing, which, there's an argument for saying that. That's what Gary Roski said. And, that had a lot of success in some places. But we need to shift it more towards, nothing. I think from what I hear, he's smoking weed at a sanctuary in Michigan most days because he's burned out.
Sounds nice.
Yeah, it does sound nice, actually. Although I've never smoked weed, for the record. So just in case the government, I don't want my probation officer getting upset and saying, you're going to haul you out. Because smoking weed technically is still a violation of federal law, for the record, even if it's legal in California. So I think it would be a probation violation if I smoke weed. But my point is just this. I think you're seeing institutional success you've never seen before in history. You're seeing victories like our court cases that I think most people thought would be impossible in places where the road was very hard. And most importantly, I think you're seeing a movement that's adapting. Because if we took the animal experimentation movement and we started just like yelling at people who are taking insulin or yelling at people who are taking drugs that were tested on animals, which all of us do. I do, frankly. Yeah. Like my dog does. My dog recently had drugs that were tested on animals. And if I went around just saying like, oh, you scumbag, you have a dog that takes medication that was tested on animals, you're a piece of shit. The reality is it is infused in our everyday behaviors, but people like you selectively frame the issue in a strategically advantageous way. It's like what Sun Tzu said thousands of years ago in The Art of War. You win or you lose based on the battleground. You've got to pick the right battleground. And you can win with a very weak army if you have the right battleground. You can lose with a very powerful army if you have a terrible battleground. Yeah. And I think for too long, the food issue, we've been fighting on the wrong battleground. And I think as we're learning to fight on the better battleground, and the same was true of the climate movement. The climate movement for too long was like telling people to take cold showers and stop driving their cars too much. And, there's some truth to that. Like it is true that if we keep driving our gas guzzling engines and, we have these massive houses that we want air conditioned, the climate's going to go haywire. But they realized, no, actually, we should target the oil and gas industry. And to some extent, we should target the factory farming industry. That's been a shift in the climate movement. And I think the progress we've seen on food animal issues, we're going to see explosions like what you saw with animal experimentation over the last 5 years in the next 10 to 15 years for food animals. That's my prediction. But we'll see. I hope I'm right, and I hope you're wrong. And I suspect you hope I'm right too, actually. But
yeah, I mean, I do. I think, a lot of the success of our group, in a lot of ways is modeled after other successful movements that also were single issue movements, single issue campaigns that didn't get polluted with other issues that welcomed other enemies, right? So,
Justin, I can already hear the cancellation that's happening on Twitter right now. There's so many people tweeting right now. Why did you platform this piece of shit? No, I'm kidding. Actually, I'm not kidding. That actually is going to happen, but that's a problem because I agree with you. I think even if you agree, even if you think intersectional campaigns are the only way to run, there should be room for disagreement. There should be room in a movement. I am totally down for people to run intersectional campaigns. I'm also glad people are running single issue campaigns like you all.
But if you look at what's effective, like gay marriage, criminal justice reform, marijuana legalization. These were single issue campaigns that were seen as liberal issues that you then, brought in people in the center and right libertarian types who want the government out of their lives in general and say this is consistent with my worldview about other things, even if this is not my personal cause. But if you tie in food issues and what you wear and what you do on the weekend and everything you automatically are alienating most people from being supporters. And it's unnecessary. It's completely unnecessary. It's actually counterproductive. But I think there's too much concern with being pure and being right and not being effective. That is interfering with
being effective
ability.
Is being right ultimately, because we're not here for our own reputations. We're here for the animals. And what the animals need is for us to save them, not for us to be pure. So the right thing to do is to be effective.
Yes, I agree.
I think you're shaming yourself too much. No, I'm serious, because you're doing the right thing if you're being effective.
Well, I know, but I mean right in the sense that
for
example, I accept the way
sense.
the way the world is, not what I want it to be like. So I know people view mice and rats as vermin, and they kill them, and they don't care. That's the way the world is right now, which is why we focus on where I think we can make progress today, and hopefully in time we can bring it on to other things dogs, cats. That's where we can be effective now and use our resources more widely and use our resources more effectively. And I think there's other ways to get at those other issues besides saying rats have rights. I think that's been a failed strategy.
But the beautiful thing is the fact that you're making these relationships with people based on your shared vision about ending experiments on dogs is going to make them more open, not just to ending experiments on rats, but probably veganism too. My guess is these connections do make people more open, because when they think about a vegan, they're probably thinking about someone like me, a crazy Berkeley hippie who's going around smashing into factory farms and removing animals. But then when they realize, oh, actually, Justin Goodman's a vegan too, and he's actually a solid dude. I worked with him on this issue, and he was on board with the stuff we're trying to do. I think that's part of how change happens. That's part of how the gay marriage movement was won, right? Just these personal relationships of people, like you read about Dick Cheney or Rob Portman, the fact that they had friends and family, and in their cases, actually family members who were gay. It was maybe the gay rights movement isn't as crazy as I thought, because I actually know someone who I agree with on other stuff. They're right-wing people who also believe in gay marriage. So I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, and I mean, Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek, two other, ethical vegans and vegetarians. So I think there is something about being a good role model and being a reasonable person who wants to find common ground with people 100%. And doesn't judge everyone constantly over everything and is more interested in making friends than enemies. I also think finding common enemies is important. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well.
I think that's true too. And there's a lot we could say about that, but because thinking about villainy in a more strategic way is, I think, one of the things the movement needs to do, because movements are basically stories, and there's no good story without a good villain, to be blunt. And how to do that in a way that's ethical, that's effective, is tricky. All right, last question. What are the most important lessons you've learned that you would pass along to people who care about animals, or people who just care about the future of the world, from the last 5 years of your life, all the turmoil, the fighting, and the successes you've seen? What do you see as like maybe the most important 2 lessons? Or even 1 lesson, if you think there's one overarching thing that you've learned.
Be opportunistic. I think that is definitely something that's been important for us. In general, I think any movement should be. I think people are maybe too shy sometimes about taking advantage of opportunities. Anthony, our president, has said 100 times, the moment trumps the message. And I think that's absolutely true. Being able to make animal testing high politics by talking about it at what might have seemed like to other people an uncomfortable time at the beginning of the pandemic, to center animal testing as the potential cause and then ultimately the likely cause of the pandemic was government-funded animal testing, which is our mission as an organization. It would have been malpractice not to do that, even though it caused us some grief, and it took time to get people to come back around. Ultimately, we were right, but also it really helped elevate the discussion about animal testing. It's not just being cruel to puppies. It's like it actually might kill 20 million people, and it did.
Yeah. Well,
so I think being opportunistic and being uncomfortable is also, get out of your comfort zone, try new things, work with people who you don't feel like, try to find common ground with people who you don't agree with anything else on, and make new friends, because just yelling into the echo chamber is not going to help the movement. It's not going to help animals. It's not going to help you win.
Yeah.
So I think not being afraid and being opportunistic, or don't be driven by fear, be driven by love for the cause and for animals, and by the fact that, ultimately you're right. And be opportunistic, take advantage of moments when you can, because they're fleeting. And elevating the beagle testing issue too is another example of taking advantage of the timing, a moment in history.
Those are great lessons. And thanks again for all the work you're doing and for sharing some of these wild stories with our audience. Justin, tell people where they can follow your work and how they can support you, and then we'll finish up, huh?
Sure. We are a relatively small nonprofit. The overwhelming majority of our revenue comes from small dollar donors, $5, $10 donations, like just from people around the country. And if you want to donate, you can visit whitecoatwaste.org to support our work. We are a nonpartisan group specifically dedicated to getting animals out of government-funded laboratories. And you can follow us on all the social media platforms at whitecoatwaste. And you can follow me, very active on Twitter, at Justin R. Goodman.
Awesome. And I'm going to become a donor myself after this conversation, because I'm super impressed with your work. So thank you so much again for sharing. Thank you for the work for the dogs, the kittens, and all the other animals. And I'm sure we'll talk another time. Okay?
Thanks, Wayne.
Keep it up, my friend. Yep.
You
bye-bye.
too.
We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.